Hello everyone, I am Chris Baker from Lucky Gunner, and today I am going to talk about the infamous Smith & Wesson Revolver internal lock. Smith & Wesson began installing these locks in their revolvers in 2001. It has been a largely unpopular feature of their product line ever since. Earlier this year, they announced new variants of their mountain gun and their classic series revolvers that will be made without the lock. These are the first lock-free exposed hammer revolvers from Smith & Wesson in 24 years. Revolver fans are hopeful that this is a sign Smith plans to eventually phase out the lock completely. There's been no official word from the company on that so far. Either way, these new lock-free models raise the question of why Smith & Wesson introduced the lock to begin with and why they are so widely hated by shooters and collectors. I actually wrote an article about this many years ago when we were first getting started with our blog, The Lucky Gunner Lounge, but I realized I've never done a video on it, so here we go. Speaking of our blog, every video we've ever made is available on The Lucky Gunner Lounge, hosted with a private service that's separate from YouTube. So if YouTube removes any more of our old videos or if they kick us off the platform completely, we are always at the lounge. You can even sign up to get an email alert whenever there is a new video posted. The Smith & Wesson revolver lock is easy to spot. You just look for a round hole in the frame that's just above the cylinder release latch. Now some of their guns do have a pin here that's a different color than the frame. That's not the lock. The lock is always above the latch. The lock-equipped guns come with a pair of these generic keys. You just stick it in there and give it a quarter turn counterclockwise, and that completely locks up the gun. You can't cock the hammer, you can't pull the trigger. You can still open and close the cylinder, however. When the lock is engaged on guns with an exposed hammer spur, there is also a little flag that pops up to indicate the locked status. For the double action only internal hammer guns, there is no flag. The lock is, of course, intended to prevent unauthorized use of the gun, primarily by children. That in itself is not the part people object to. Lots of guns over the years have come with various internal and external locking devices. Most of them are easy enough to ignore if you don't have any use for them. The Smith & Wesson revolver lock has attracted so much disdain because of how and why it was implemented. To understand the origin of the lock, let's go back to the very tail end of the 1900s. While I was rocking the latest turn-of-the-century style, Smith & Wesson struggled on the brink of bankruptcy. Long story short, they had suffered from years of mediocre leadership and lost a huge portion of their market share to Glock. And now, once again, we have to talk about Clinton-era gun control. I hate to bring up politics of any kind here, but that administration's policies just did so much to shape the gun industry that it's really unavoidable. Just please don't take this as an invitation to enlighten us with your political rant in the comments. Okay, so in the late 90s, the lawyers that had gutted the tobacco industry, they set their sights on gun companies with a barrage of product liability lawsuits. The whole industry was at serious risk, but Smith & Wesson in particular was vulnerable. The Clinton administration offered to step in and negotiate a settlement for all the major manufacturers, but ultimately, Smith & Wesson is the only company that showed up and accepted the terms. In exchange for being dropped from the lawsuits, they had to agree to make a number of changes to their products and business.
Under the agreement, Smith & Wesson will include locking devices and other safety features, and will develop smart guns that can be fired only by the adults who own them. The company will cut off dealers who sell disproportionate numbers of guns that turn up in crimes, and will require all its dealers.
And the list goes on for quite a while, and some of the provisions in there were pretty extreme and either practically or technically unrealistic. Anyway, the part that we care about right now is the locking device requirement. Within 60 days, Smith & Wesson would have to include an external lock with every gun, and within 2 years, an internal locking device. Meanwhile, the rest of the gun industry was still facing those lawsuits, so Smith & Wesson's CEO figured everyone else eventually will see the writing on the wall, and they will also sign the Clinton agreement. What happened instead was a massive NRA-led boycott of Smith & Wesson. They were branded as traitors to the industry, and their bottom line took another massive hit. When George W. Bush took over the White House the following year, his administration released Smith & Wesson from the agreement, and they never had to actually follow through on most of those provisions. But by that time, they had already incorporated an internal lock into their new revolvers. Since 2001, the lock has been built into most, but not all, Smith & Wesson revolvers. They have always offered at least some double-action only J-frame revolvers without locks. At first, these were only offered in very limited runs. Then about 10 or 15 years ago, they started making more of them and began to actually advertise lock-free versions of certain J-frame models. And today it seems like more DAO guns come without the lock than with it. But again, that's only the small frames, the J-frames. Every variant of their medium and large frame revolvers has had the lock since 2001 until this year. That's why it's such a big deal that they are now offering the Classic Series and the Mountain guns without a lock. Not everybody hates the Smith & Wesson lock. Plenty of shooters are content to just ignore it. Most casual gun owners probably don't even know that it's there, but I have never met an active fan of the lock, and those who dislike it tend to be passionate about their contempt. There are three main reasons the lock is so fiercely despised by revolver enthusiasts. The first is the political issue. A lot of people view it as a symbol of Smith & Wesson caving to pressure from the gun control lobby. And it doesn't help that Smith continued to install the locks long after the Clinton agreement was gone and forgotten. But most shooters don't actually pay close attention to industry news, let alone stuff that happened over 2 decades ago. If that had been the only problem with the lock, it would have eventually faded from memory. But it's got other issues, like the fact that it's ugly. It leaves a big hole in the side of the frame along with the conspicuous laser-etched arrow and letter L. Gun people in general, and revolver people in particular, are suckers for traditional aesthetics. Some of us may deny it, but all else being equal, we will usually pick a pretty gun over an ugly one. Many revolver fans, myself included, believe the lock spoils the otherwise classic look of Smith & Wesson's wheel guns. The biggest problem with the lock is that it's a poor design. Specifically, they have been known to occasionally self-engage under recoil. So you fire a couple of rounds, the recoil makes the revolver lock itself, but you don't actually know that until you try to fire it again and the trigger doesn't move. That is not ideal for a life-saving tool. Now, to be fair, almost every credible report of this has been with one of Smith's super lightweight scandium frame revolvers firing magnum ammo. And even then, it's an uncommon issue. It's even less common with the steel frame models and even the non-magnum versions of the lightweight revolvers. But it is troubling that the lock was designed in a way that even allows the possibility of that kind of malfunction. Even though the problem has been grossly exaggerated by internet rumors, I completely understand why some people refuse to trust a lock-equipped revolver for self-defense. I have never heard a good explanation for why Smith & Wesson kept installing the locks even after they were free from the Clinton agreement. In the past, company reps that I've talked to have just told me it's because of lawyers. That doesn't explain why they haven't redesigned the lock to address some of these problems. It seems like ignoring a known defect with a safety device would expose them to just as much legal liability as having no lock at all, but I'm not a lawyer. Like most gun owners, I am totally in favor of keeping guns secured away from kids and other people who aren't supposed to have access to them. But there are much better solutions than the Smith & Wesson internal lock. Generally speaking, guns should either be within arm's reach or locked up in a container of some kind. At the very least, you can use one of these cheap cable locks that come with every new gun. You just run it through either the barrel or through one of the chambers in the cylinder. They're not great quality, but unlike the internal lock, you can easily see at a glance that the revolver is disabled and unloaded. If given the choice, I would prefer a revolver without the lock, but I wouldn't necessarily refuse to own or use a lock-equipped model. There are some excellent revolvers Smith & Wesson only introduced after 2001, and they've never been made without a lock. And for some of the older models, the pre-lock variants can be hard to track down, or they cost a lot more than the lock-equipped versions. Fortunately, if you really don't like the lock, it is fairly easy to completely remove from these revolvers. I'll get in trouble if I show you how to do it here, but there are plenty of tutorials elsewhere. You can even buy an aftermarket plug to fill the hole left in your frame if you remove the lock. It may not look great from a legal perspective to remove a safety device from a self-defense gun, but again, I'm not a lawyer, so what do I know? Well, I know that I am excited about the possibility of more lock-free Smith & Wesson revolvers in the near future, but lock or no lock, your revolver probably needs some ammo, and you should get that from us with lightning fast shipping at Lucky Gunner.